Hattie laid the iron key on the kitchen counter where it had hung on the same nail for 45 years, and she felt the silence of the house close around her like water filling a sunken room. The bank did not want to know about the man she had buried 6 months ago. They did not want to hear about the dementia that had taken him in pieces, or the smooth-talking advisor who had emptied their savings while Mortimer believed he was protecting her future. They did not want to know about the nights she had sat awake reading legal letters with a magnifying glass, trying to understand which signatures were his and which had been forged in a hand that almost looked like his. To them, she was a delinquent account number with a name attached. At 72 years old, she was just another widow whose grief had run out of legal protection. She walked out the front door of the only home she had ever truly loved with one cardboard box pressed against her chest and exactly $8 in her coat pocket. The change from the small bag of groceries she had bought the morning after the funeral, when she had stood in the cereal aisle and forgotten why she was there. What she did next, the whole town of Pine Bridge called madness. She drove out to a county auction and used every coin and crumpled bill she had to buy a farmhouse the assessor's office had labeled non-recoverable. A collapsed wreck on 3 rocky acres at the dead end of Foxglove Hollow Road. No roof over half of it. No working well. No future by any measurement anyone in that auction room could imagine. But over the next 8 months, inside the rotting walls of that abandoned farmhouse, Hattie Sundberg uncovered something that had been sealed beneath the floorboards for more than 100 years. Something the bank could never have taken from her because they had never known it existed. And on a cold morning to the following spring, the same developer who had once stood beside the loan officer at her eviction came driving back up that dirt road in a black SUV, this time with a check in her hand and a request she would have to learn how to refuse. $8. That is all it took to change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The house on Sycamore Lane had been built in 1958, and Hattie and Mortimer Sundberg had bought it in the autumn of 1979 with a down payment scraped together from her teaching salary and his small inheritance from a logging uncle in the Northeast Kingdom. It was a modest 2-story clapboard with a gray slate roof and a screen porch that wrapped around the south side, where the morning light came in through the elms that Mortimer had planted himself the second spring they lived there. Pine Bridge was the kind of small Vermont town where the same family had run the hardware store for 4 generations, where the Congregational Church on the Green still rang its bell at noon, and where everyone within a mile radius knew when somebody's pipes froze in February. Hattie had taught 3rd grade at the elementary school on Maple Street for 32 years. Mortimer had been the bookkeeper for the dairy cooperative outside town, a quiet, careful man who balanced ledgers by hand long after the rest of the world had moved on to spreadsheets. They had raised 2 children in the house on Sycamore Lane. Florence, the older one, who had loved horses and history and had died of a brain aneurysm at the age of 34 with no warning, no symptoms, no chance to say goodbye. And Wallace, the younger, who had become a software engineer in Seattle and had not visited home for more than 3 days at a time in the last 15 years. Hattie had learned the house the way you learn a person you have lived beside for a very long time. She knew the way the back door stuck on humid August afternoons and released easily in October. She knew the precise step on the staircase that creaked under her weight and the one that creaked only under Mortimer's. She knew that the kitchen window over the sink, the one she had washed dishes in front of since the Carter administration, framed the elm trees and the side yard at exactly the angle that turned a January afternoon into something worth standing still inside of. She had cooked roughly 43,000 meals in that kitchen. By her own approximate count, one quiet evening, when she had tried to do the math and then stopped, because the number had felt both too large and too small to mean anything. She had washed the floors of that house more times than she could remember. She had argued with Mortimer in the front hallway about whether to repaint the dining room, and made up with him in the same hallway an hour later. She had nursed both her children through chicken pox in the back bedroom. She had sat on the screen porch with Florence the summer before the aneurysm and shelled 2 bushels of peas while her daughter, already a grown woman by then, told her about a man she was thinking of marrying. They had not, in the end, gotten married. Florence had died 9 months later. Hattie had kept the bowl from that afternoon on the porch ever since. She had loved this house the way you love something that has held everything important you have ever done. Not the slate roof, or the bay window, or the elm trees. Exactly, but the sediment of a life that had settled inside the rooms and the floors and the walls until the house itself had become a kind of co-author of who she was. The morning the bank's representatives arrived, she was in the kitchen putting the kettle on, the way she had every morning of her adult life, and she heard the deliberate sound of 2 car doors closing in front of the house, and she stopped with her hand on the knob of the stove. She knew the sound. She had been waiting for it. She had imagined it for so many weeks that when it finally arrived, what she felt was not surprise but a strange, almost grateful exhaustion. The waiting was over. The thing she had been bracing against was going to happen now, and after it happened, she would no longer have to brace. She turned off the stove. She set the kettle down on a cool burner. She picked up her cardboard box from the kitchen table, where she had set it the night before, and she walked down the front hall toward the door. She stopped only once, in the hallway, to lay her flat palm against the wall in the spot just above the light switch where Mortimer's hand had always rested when he came home in the evenings, before he hung his coat on the hook by the door. The wall was cooler than her hand. The house had already begun to forget her. Mortimer's illness had not arrived the way Hattie had always assumed serious illness arrived. There had been no single terrible morning, no phone call from a doctor's office, no envelope of test results sitting on the kitchen table. There had been instead a slow accumulation of small things that she had explained away, one at a time, for nearly 2 years before she allowed herself to put them together. He had begun forgetting names. He had begun setting his coffee cup down in the wrong rooms. He had once driven home from the dairy cooperative and parked in the driveway of the house next door, which had been there for as long as the Sundbergs had, and sat in the car for 10 minutes, wondering why his key did not fit the kitchen door he was looking at. He had come inside that night and laughed about it at the dinner table, and Hattie had laughed with him because laughing felt safer than the other thing. The diagnosis came on a Wednesday in March, 3 years before the morning the bank arrived. Early onset cognitive decline, the neurologist had said, with a careful gentleness that Hattie remembered more than she remembered the words themselves. Probably an atypical form of Alzheimer's. Possibly something else. Difficult to say with certainty. They were given a prognosis of 5 to 7 years, and Mortimer had taken her hand in the parking lot afterward and said, "We will figure it out, Hattie. We always do." And she had believed him because she had believed him about everything for 44 years, and she did not yet understand that the man saying those words was already, in some quiet, invisible way, a different man than the one who had said them 6 months earlier. He had wanted desperately to protect her. That was the part she would understand later, when there was nothing left to do but understand. He had become convinced, in the early stages of the disease, that he needed to make sure she would have enough money after he was gone. He had begun answering phone calls he should not have answered. He had begun reading financial newsletters that had arrived in the mail without their having subscribed to them. And somewhere in that fragile window between the diagnosis and the period when his decline became visible enough that Hattie began handling the mail and the checkbook herself, a man named Lucian Brace had introduced himself to Mortimer at the Dairy Cooperative's annual breakfast and offered him a chance to participate in what he called a Heritage Agricultural Fund. Hattie did not know about Lucian Brace until 8 weeks after Mortimer's funeral, when the first letter from the bank arrived. By then, Mortimer had been in the ground long enough that the soil over him had settled, and Hattie had been moving through the house in the careful, half-anesthetized way of a woman doing the small daily things while she waited for some larger feeling to arrive that did not seem in any hurry to come. The letter said that the home equity line of credit was past due. Hattie had read the letter twice, then a third time, and then she had walked into the small office off the kitchen where Mortimer had kept his ledgers, and she had begun pulling files out of the drawers. What she found, over the following 2 weeks of slow forensic reading, broke something inside her in a way she had not expected to be broken again. There had never been any Heritage Agricultural Fund. There had been a series of wire transfers beginning 18 months before Mortimer's death, made out to a holding company in Delaware that no longer existed. There had been a second mortgage taken out against the house on Sycamore Lane, The paperwork signed in a handwriting that was almost Mortimer's, but not quite. There had been the liquidation of the small retirement account that Hattie had assumed was still sitting where she had last seen it. There had been, in total, just over $300,000 sent to a man Hattie had never met, who had charmed her husband during the months when her husband was no longer entirely able to recognize being charmed. She had reported it. She had hired an attorney from a county over who had taken her case seriously and had spent 4 months trying to recover something. Lucian Brace, it turned out, had used at least 3 other names in at least 4 other states and was, at the time of the investigation, somewhere outside the country. There would be no recovery. There would only be the debts and the second mortgage and the original mortgage and the medical bills from the last 6 months of Mortimer's life, when even the disability coverage had begun to push back against the costs of the in-home aid. Hattie had sat at the kitchen table the evening she finally understood the full picture, and she had not cried. She had, instead, made herself a cup of tea, because making tea was something her hands knew how to do without instruction. And she had thought about Mortimer the way you think about someone you have been married to for 44 years when you have just learned something that you cannot tell them because they are not there to tell. She had not been angry with him. She would never be angry with him. She had understood, sitting there, that he had been trying to take care of her, and that the disease had taken his judgment before it had taken anything else, and that the man who had wired that money had not been the man she had married. The man she had married would never have kept it from her. The letters from the bank had begun arriving more frequently after that. The bank gave Hattie 30 days, and the 30 days arrived and ended the way all imposed time periods do, regardless of what the person inside them is trying to accomplish. She called Wallace in Seattle on the second night, and the conversation went in the way Hattie had assumed it would. He was sympathetic in the verbal sense and overwhelmed in the practical sense. He had 2 children in private school, a mortgage of his own, a wife whose mother had recently moved into assisted living. He said he would send what he could. He sent $1,500 by wire 2 days later, which Hattie used to pay the smaller of the 2 medical balances, and which did not, in any meaningful sense, change the shape of what was coming. She did not call him a second time. She did not blame him. He had been close to Florence and had not entirely recovered from her death, and Hattie had decided long ago that she was not going to be the kind of mother who collected emotional debts from her surviving child. She spent the 30 days walking through the house the way you walk through a museum that has displayed your own life without telling you in advance. She stood in the doorway of Florence's old bedroom for a long time on a Tuesday afternoon, looking at the wallpaper Florence had picked out herself in 1981, and she did not allow herself to do more than look. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning the bank's representatives came, she carried her cardboard box past them without speaking, and she drove into town in the small Toyota that was the only vehicle the creditors had not yet been able to reach. And she checked herself into the Pine Bridge Inn on Route 12, an extended-stay motel that had once been a Howard Johnson's and that now rented rooms by the week to construction crews and to people whose lives were temporarily without other arrangements. The room had a microwave, a small refrigerator, a bed with a polyester comforter the color of weak coffee, and a window that looked out on the parking lot of a closed-down Radio Shack. Hattie unpacked her cardboard box onto the dresser. The box contained the photographs of Florence, the photographs of Mortimer, her mother's wedding ring, a copy of the deed to the house she no longer owned, and the small bowl from the screen porch, the one Florence had eaten peas out of the summer before she died. She set the bowl on the bedside table. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without turning on the television. She had been at the Pine Bridge Inn for 9 days when she found the notice. The motel left a stack of free weeklies near the ice machine on the second floor, and Hattie had taken to picking up the Wildemere County Gazette in the evenings as a way of not watching the television and not thinking about anything in particular. The notice was tucked between the obituary page and the high school sports scores. County land disposal auction. Surplus and condemned properties. Saturday morning, the 11th of November, at the Agricultural Extension Building. 14 parcels listed. Hattie read the descriptions slowly, her finger moving down the column, until she came to the last one. Parcel 9, 3.1 acres with structure, Foxglove Hollow Road, 9 miles north of town. Structure condemned by County Order, 2017. Minimum bid not established. Property classified non-recoverable. No utilities. Access road unpaved and seasonal. She read the listing 4 times. Non-recoverable. She knew, from years of reading school district memos and town council minutes back, when she was still teaching, what non-recoverable meant in the language of county clerks. It meant that no one had wanted it. It meant that the property had failed to find a taker through every standard process the county had attempted, and that the auction was a final administrative gesture before whatever happened to land that not even free could move. She folded the paper carefully and put it inside the deep front pocket of her wool coat, the same coat she had worn out the door of the house on Sycamore Lane, the coat that still held the $8 in change. The night before the auction, she sat on the edge of the bed in the motel room and made herself look at the situation with the same clear, plain honesty she had been practicing since the morning Mortimer died. She was 72 years old. She had $8 to her name. Her Social Security would begin depositing in 11 days. The motel would eat the Social Security faster than the Social Security could replenish itself. She had no plan that extended beyond the end of the calendar month. Wallace would help if she asked, and she was not going to ask again. What she wanted, she understood, sitting there on the polyester comforter in a room that smelled faintly of someone else's cigarettes from a decade earlier, was something that belonged to her. Not borrowed, not temporary, not arranged by anyone else's pity. A condemned farmhouse on 3 rocky acres at the end of an unpaved road in early November in northern Vermont was not, by any measurement she could reasonably apply, a solution to the situation she was sitting inside of. But it was land, and it was available for whatever was in her pocket. She had learned, late in her life, that the reasonable measurement was not always the right one. She arrived at the agricultural extension building 40 minutes early. The Saturday morning was the kind of cold November morning that made the air feel like it had small pieces of glass suspended in it. The building itself was a low, brown, cinder-block structure on the edge of the fairgrounds, used most of the year for 4-H meetings and Grange potlucks. Inside, perhaps 40 people had already gathered, mostly men, mostly the kind of men who attended these auctions as a matter of regional habit. Farmers in canvas coats. A pair of investors from Burlington who had driven up the night before. Several regulars who, Hattie could tell from the way they greeted each other, attended every county auction within a 100-mile radius the way other people attended church. She registered at the folding table by the door. Boyd Hallowell, the county clerk, a soft-spoken man in his late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on top of his head, handed her a laminated bidder card with a number 27 printed on it and asked her, with a particular gentleness of small-town officials toward older women they did not recognize, whether she had attended one of these before. Hattie told him she had not. He explained the process briefly. She thanked him. She found a folding chair toward the back of the room and sat down with her coat still buttoned, the bidder card resting on her knees. The auctioneer, Truman Goff, was a compact, broad-shouldered man in a flannel shirt who had the unhurried manner of someone who had been doing this for 30 years and was no longer impressed by anything that happened in the room. He moved through the first 8 parcels with professional efficiency. A scrap parcel near the river, a failed gravel pit, a small commercial lot in a neighboring township. The bids came in. The hands went up. Hattie watched the rhythm of the room, the way the serious bidders held themselves still until the very last second, the way the casual ones lost interest by the 3rd bid. The man in the chair to her left, a heavy-set farmer who had introduced himself as Earl without being asked, gave her his unsolicited opinion of every parcel as it sold, and Hattie thanked him each time without indicating she had any intention of bidding on anything. Parcel 9 came toward the end. Truman Goff looked down at his clipboard when he reached it, and then up at the room with an expression Hattie had seen before on the faces of people who already know how something is going to go and are obligated to walk through it anyway. Parcel 9, he said, 3.1 acres on Foxglove Hollow Road, approximately 9 miles north of town. Structure on the property. Farmhouse, condemned by county order in 2017. Property classified non-recoverable by the assessor's office. No minimum bid established. We will open the floor. The room was quiet in the particular way a room is quiet when 40 people are simultaneously deciding whether a moment is funny or simply odd. Someone toward the front made a low remark to the person beside him, and the person beside him produced a short, controlled exhalation that was almost a laugh and not quite. Earl, beside Hattie, shook his head with the expression of a man whose worldview had just been confirmed. Any opening bid, Truman Goff said. Hattie raised her bidder card. Bidder 27, Truman Goff said, and the room turned in its chairs to look at her. What is the bid, ma'am? $8, Hattie said. The room did not laugh outright. It produced instead a distributed version of laughter that traveled through posture and small sounds and the particular silence of people who are uncertain whether laughing aloud would be appropriate. Someone coughed. Earl, beside her, had gone very still in his chair. Truman Goff wrote the number down on his clipboard with the professional neutrality of a man who had genuinely seen everything. $8, he repeated. Are there any other bids on parcel 9? The room was silent. $8 going once. $8 going twice. A pause in which the room held its collective breath. Sold to bidder 27. Hattie walked to the front of the room and counted out the $8 from her coat pocket. A $5 bill, 2 singles, and 4 quarters. She signed the transfer paperwork that Boyd Hallowell slid across the folding table. She received in return a copy of the transfer document, a hand-drawn map photocopied so many times the lines had begun to fade, and an iron key on a plain metal ring. The key was old, dark with age, the kind of key that belonged to a door that had been locked for a very long time. She drove out to Foxglove Hollow Road that same afternoon, following the map past the point where the asphalt ended and the gravel began, past the point where the gravel narrowed into 2 tire tracks running through dead grass, up a slow incline that her small Toyota navigated with more difficulty than she would have preferred until the tracks stopped at a sagging wire gate. She got out and walked the last quarter mile. She had prepared herself. She had not prepared herself enough. The farmhouse sat in a clearing of dead goldenrod and frost-killed milkweed, and at first glance it looked less like a building than like the suggestion of one. Half the roof had collapsed inward over what had been the kitchen and a back room. The front porch had separated from the house entirely and lay sideways in the weeds. A single intact window stared at her from the front wall like the eye of something that had been waiting. The door was swollen in its frame and required her full weight to move. Inside, the smell hit her first. The smell of a sealed space that had developed its own atmosphere over a decade of being left alone. Old wood, mouse leavings, damp plaster, and underneath all of it something faintly herbal that she did not yet have a way to identify. The floorboards in the main room had given way in 3 places. The walls were intact but stained dark from years of unaddressed water. A stone fireplace on the eastern wall, miraculously, looked structurally sound. A cast-iron cook stove sat against the kitchen wall, its surface coated in a uniform gray dust that suggested it had not been touched since before the county had condemned the place. Hattie stood in the middle of the main room and looked up through the collapsed section of roof at the sky, which was the color of dishwater, and she felt, all at once, the full weight of what she had done. She was 72 years old. She was alone in the ruins of a condemned farmhouse 9 miles from town. The temperature was dropping. She had no food beyond a granola bar in her coat pocket. She had no water beyond a half-empty plastic bottle in the car. She had spent the last money she had to her name on this collapsing structure, and she had perhaps 3 hours of daylight left. She went back down to the car and brought up the cardboard box and the wool blanket from the back seat. She set the box on the most solid section of floor she could find, near the fireplace, and she sat down beside it. She took out the photograph of Florence on the screen porch the summer before she died, and she held it in both hands in the fading light. After a long while, she put the photograph carefully back into the box. Then she stood up and began gathering wood. There was no shortage of wood. The collapsed porch alone provided more than she could burn in a week, and the dry weeds and dead branches around the clearing gave her tinder. She built a small, careful fire in the stone fireplace using a book of matches from the motel, and the fireplace, against everything she had any reason to expect, drew properly. The smoke went up the chimney. The flames caught and held. She wrapped herself in the blanket and sat on the hearthstones and watched the fire. And she thought about Mortimer, and she did not let herself think about Mortimer too much. The first night was an education. The wind came down off the ridge after dark and found every gap in the walls. The temperature dropped into the high 20s. She slept in fragments, woke each time the fire burned low, fed it again, returned to a half-sleep with the iron key from the auction tucked in her closed fist for reasons she could not articulate. Around 3 in the morning, she stopped trying to sleep and simply sat by the fire with a blanket around her shoulders and made herself work through the situation in the same plain, honest way she had practiced since the morning of Mortimer's death. She had 3 things to figure out in order. A roof over the open section, because the next rain would destroy what remained of the floor. A way to get water that did not involve the 9-mile drive into town every 2 days. A sleeping arrangement that did not require her to share the floor with whatever lived underneath it. 3 things. She could work on 3 things. By the time the sky began to lighten, she had a list. She drove in a Pine Bridge the next morning when her Social Security deposited and bought a heavy tarp, a basic set of tools, a pry bar, work gloves, rope, a 5-gallon water container, a propane camp stove, and a week's worth of food that did not require refrigeration. She returned to the property and began. The first weeks were an education in the difference between knowing a thing was hard and knowing it inside her own body. Her hands blistered and then calloused. Her back informed her every morning of opinions it had not previously seen fit to share. She stretched the tarp over the open section of roof on the 3rd day with the help of a length of rope and a borrowed ladder from a hardware store in town that she returned the same evening. She cleared the collapsed porch debris. She stabilized the worst of the floor with porch boards laid across the gaps. A neighbor appeared on the 4th day. A man in his mid-70s with a white beard and a green pickup truck pulled up at the gate, watched her for several minutes, and then walked up the track without introducing himself. Emmett Larkin, he said when he reached her. He lived 1.5 miles down the road. He had seen the smoke from her chimney for 3 nights in a row and had wanted to make sure nobody had set the place on fire. He looked at the tarp on the roof. He looked at the tools laid out on the porch boards. He nodded once. And the next morning he came back with a face cord of seasoned firewood in the bed of his truck and helped her stack it against the eastern wall without asking permission. He did not stay long. He came back twice more that first week. He did not ask questions she did not want to answer. It was on the 16th day that she found the hatch. She had been pulling up rotted floorboards near the kitchen wall, working slowly with the pry bar in the careful, methodical rhythm she had developed over the previous 2 weeks. Most of the boards came up with little resistance, the nails so corroded they crumbled in the wood. But the section directly beneath where the kitchen counter had once stood resisted her. The boards there were of a different grade, entirely thicker, tighter-grained, fitted with the kind of precision that did not match the rest of the construction. She sat back on her heels and looked at them for a long moment. She cleared the debris off the section completely. She brushed away the fine dust of 100 years of settled grime with the side of her gloved hand. And there, set flush into heavy planking that was considerably more solid than the flooring around it, she saw the iron ring. A pull handle, also iron, also flush when not in use. Around the perimeter, a thin black line of what had once been a wax seal, brittle and broken in places but unmistakable. A hatch, set into the floor with the intention of being kept. Hattie sat back fully on the cold floorboards and looked at it for a longer moment still. She was 72 years old, and she was alone in a farmhouse 9 miles from town that she had bought for $8 3 weeks earlier, and she had just found a hatch in the floor that no one in the assessor's office had ever mentioned. She thought about this with the careful, slow attention she had been practicing. Then she stood up, fetched the lantern, and tried the ring. The hatch did not lift easily. It had been sealed for a long time, and it had no interest in being unsealed. But it was not locked, and with a pry bar and a sustained effort that left her sitting against the wall afterward, catching her breath, the hatch came up. A breath of air rose from the opening, cool and dry and unmistakably herbal. The smell of a space that had been sealed long enough to develop its own preserved atmosphere. The smell, faintly, of chamomile and dried lavender, and something deeper she could not yet name. Stone steps, 8 of them, leading down into a cellar with a packed earth floor and a low, beamed ceiling that she would have to duck to walk under. She brought the lantern. She went down. The cellar ran the length of the kitchen and extended beneath what had been the back room, wider than she had expected. Along the western wall, on shelves built with the same care as the cabin's bones, sat row after row of glass apothecary bottles. Hand-blown, irregular, sealed with cork and wax. Each one labeled in a small, precise copperplate handwriting on a paper tag tied with twine. Calendula tincture, yarrow, lobelia, black cohosh, valerian root, bee balm. The labels had faded to the color of weak tea, but the writing remained legible. Some of the bottles were empty, their contents long since evaporated through the wax. Many were not. Along the eastern wall stood drying racks built of cherry wood, and on the racks, in small linen bundles, hung dried botanicals so old they had become almost translucent. Below the racks, on low wooden shelves, sat tin boxes the size of a hand. Hattie opened the closest one. Inside were paper packets, each one labeled in the same hand. Calendula, 1919. Tobacco mullein, 1921. Heirloom tomato, brandywine strain, 1918. Inside each packet, kept dry by the cellar's preserved atmosphere and the wax-sealed lid of the tin, were seeds. Brown, gray, beige, some no larger than grains of sand, others the size of pumpkin seeds. Dozens of varieties she could not name, and several she could. Against the back wall, on a small writing table that had been built into the stone, sat a stack of leather-bound journals. Hattie sat down on the bottom step of the stone stairs and placed the lantern on the floor and did not move for a very long time. The journals belonged to a man named Bartholomew Crane. She would learn his name from the first journal she opened. He had been a herbalist and beekeeper, born in 1859, who had built this farmhouse in 1891 and had lived in alone for 42 years until his death in the winter of 1933. His handwriting filled 12 volumes. Patient observations of plants, of bees, of weather, of the people in the surrounding hollows who had come to him over the decades for tinctures and teas and quiet counsel that the country doctor in Pine Bridge could not or would not provide. Hattie would read those journals slowly over the months that followed, and she would come to feel that she had met him. She climbed back up the stone steps that first evening with one of the seed tins in her hand, because she wanted to look more carefully at the packets in better light. She set the tin on the floor beside the fire and began going through the packets one at a time. And it was inside the 7th packet, a fragile one labeled Calendula, 1919, that she found the folded square of paper that did not belong with the seeds. The paper was newer, cleaner, modern-lined notepad paper, folded twice. She unfolded it slowly. Her name was on the outside. In handwriting she would have known anywhere in the world. The handwriting was Mortimer's. The packet was from a small heirloom seed company they had visited together on an anniversary trip to the Champlain Valley 4 summers earlier. She had not opened the packet. She had forgotten she still owned it. She sat by the fire a long time before she opened it. She had not cried since the first night on the property. She had felt the grief the way one feels a steady weather, but she had been too busy or too determined or too deep in the practical work of staying alive to allow it to come all the way through. She unfolded the paper carefully, the way you unfold something you have been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. He had written it 11 months before he died, in one of the long, quiet windows where his clarity returned for a few hours and he could think the way he had once thought. Hattie, the letter began, I do not know when you will find this, or whether you will find it at all. I am hiding it tonight inside a packet of seeds we bought on the trip we took to the lake this summer before everything started to change, because I'm hoping that if anything ever happens to me and to the things I've been trying so hard to keep safe, the seeds will be one of the things you decide to keep. You have always been the kind of woman who keeps seeds. I have done something I am ashamed of. I do not yet know how badly I have done it, because the man who came to talk to me about it makes promises that sound real when he says them, and that I cannot evaluate the way I once could. I am writing to you tonight because I am afraid, and because I do not trust my own mind to remember to tell you any of this when it matters, and because if I am wrong about him, you may someday be reading this letter alone in a kitchen I am no longer in. If that is where you are when you read this, I want you to know that none of it was ever your fault. None of it. I have watched you carry hard things for 44 years, and I have watched you do it without ever making any of us feel that we were the burden you were carrying. You have the steadiest hands of any person I have ever known. Trust them. Trust what you know. Wherever you end up, you will know how to make a home, because making things into homes is what you have always done. I love you. I am sorry. Mortimer. Hattie held the letter in both hands and let the thing she had been holding off for 10 months come all the way through. She cried for her husband, and for the man he had been before he was no longer entirely that man, and for Florence on the screen porch with a bowl of peas, and for the house on Sycamore Lane that had forgotten her, and for the version of herself she had been only 1 year earlier, who had not yet known any of what she now knew. She cried until she was finished. Then she folded the letter, slid it into the front pocket of her flannel shirt, and went down into the cellar to look at the seeds again with different eyes. The work changed shape after that. The cabin still needed repairing. The roof still needed proper coverage before the worst of winter, and Emmett Larkin came with a younger man named Reuben from down the road, and the three of them stretched proper roofing, felt over the open section, and tarred the seams, and laid down enough metal sheeting from a salvage yard to keep the weather out until spring. But the cellar became, in the evenings after the day's labor was done, the room where Hattie's life began to find its second shape. She read the journals. She cataloged the bottles. She separated the seed tins by family, then by year. She drove in a Pine Bridge on a Thursday and used the public library's microfiche to look up Bartholomew Crane and learned that he had been written about, briefly, in a 1968 regional history of folk medicine in the Northeast Kingdom, and that the article had described his collected papers as lost, presumed destroyed. Phyllis Granger appeared in the second month. She was 78, recently widowed herself, and she had heard from her cousin who knew Emmett that there was a woman out on Foxglove Hollow who was making the place habitable and could probably use a friend. She brought a loaf of brown bread the first time and stayed 40 minutes. She came back the following Thursday with a jar of tomato preserves. By the fourth visit, she was bringing her own thermos of coffee and staying until the light went. Quentin Mabry arrived in the third month. He had driven up from Boston on a referral from someone who knew Phyllis. He did not say much about why he had come. He sat for 3 hours in what was beginning to look, even in early winter, like the bones of a garden, and he left a small envelope on the porch with a card that said only thank you, and a handwritten address in case Hattie ever needed anything. By spring, she had cleared the eastern slope and started the food beds. By early summer, she had begun planting for Bartholomew Crane's seed stock, working from the journal's notes on which varieties had grown well in which corners of the property. Dr. Ingrid Solberg, a retired ethnobotanist who had heard about the cellar from Phyllis's nephew at the university, drove up in May and walked through the cellar in silence for half an hour before she sat down on the stone steps and quietly told Hattie that what she was looking at was a regionally significant find. By the following autumn, Hattie had been on the property for a full year. The farmhouse was no longer the structure she had first walked into. The roof had been redone with proper sheeting and reinforced rafters, the work done by Hattie and Emmett over the summer with materials paid for by the small honoraria Dr. Solberg had arranged through her university contacts in exchange for the academic cataloging of 3 of Bartholomew Crane's journals. The collapsed porch had been rebuilt from cherry timber milled from a fallen tree on the property's western edge, and Hattie had built it herself with Emmett's quiet supervision, learning the joinery as she went. The kitchen floor had been replaced. The cast-iron cook stove, cleaned and reseated, had begun to do what cook stoves are designed to do. A new well had been drilled in the spring with the help of a small grant from a state preservation agency that Dr. Solberg had also arranged. The cellar remained the cellar. It was the heart of the property, and Hattie had decided early that its character would not be altered. The shelves still held Bartholomew Crane's apothecary glass. The drying racks still held bundles of dried herbs, some of them now Hattie's own first harvests, hung beside the older ones the way a younger handwriting accumulates beside an older one in a long-running ledger. The seed tins had been moved to a wooden cabinet Hattie had built specifically for them, sealed against moisture, organized by family and by year, with the original 1918, and after stock kept separate from the new generations, she had begun growing out and replenishing. The eastern slope had become a working garden. Heirloom tomatoes Hattie now had 4 generations of, descended directly from Bartholomew Crane's 1918 stock. Calendula in long rows that bloomed orange against the late summer grass. Yarrow, valerian, lobelia, bee balm, lemon balm, hyssop, mullein, all of them grown from the seeds in the cellar tins. All of them documented in a notebook Hattie kept on the kitchen table in the same kind of small, precise handwriting Bartholomew Crane had used 100 years earlier. She had hand-painted a wooden sign, and Emmett had hung it on a post at the bottom of the drive. Foxglove Hollow Apothecary and Seed Library. Visitors by appointment. The sign had been there 4 months. The Thursday in October, when the black SUV came up the road, Hattie was in the front bed, cutting back the calendula stalks with Phyllis kneeling beside her. Hattie heard the engine before she saw the vehicle, the unmistakable sound of a heavy car climbing a gravel track at a speed it was not designed for. She set down her shears and stood up and brushed the dirt off her knees. And Phyllis, who had been at the property long enough to read Hattie's posture, quietly stood as well and went to put the kettle on without being asked. The woman who got out of the SUV was perhaps 50 years old, well-dressed in the deliberate way of a person who has selected clothing for a specific impression, and she stood at the bottom of the drive looking up at the property for a long moment before she began walking toward Hattie. Tabitha Crew introduced herself. She represented a development group out of Burlington that had been buying up parcels in the Foxglove Valley for the past several years. She had become aware of the property's restoration through Reginald Pickett, who had mentioned it to her at a regional banking conference. She had brought, she said, what she hoped Hattie would consider a meaningful offer. Hattie listened. She had learned in the past year to listen the way Bartholomew Crane had apparently listened, judging by the journals, completely without interruption until the other person had finished saying what they had come to say. The number Tabitha Crew named would have meant something very different to the woman who had walked off Sycamore Lane with $8 in her pocket. It meant something different to the woman who was hearing it now. When Tabitha Crew was finished, Hattie was quiet for a moment. She was quiet because she was thinking, not because she was performing. She had stopped performing quiet sometime around the middle of the spring. "I appreciate the drive," Hattie said. "It is a long way up here." Tabitha Crew nodded, the way a person nods who believes she is at the beginning of a negotiation. "What I have here," Hattie said, "is not a property. It is the place where I learned that my husband loved me even at the end, when he could not always remember why. It is the place where I learned what my hands could do, which I had forgotten for a while. It is where people come now when they need somewhere quiet and good to be." She looked at Tabitha Crew steadily. "You cannot buy that. The bank could not, and you cannot." Tabitha Crew was quiet for a long moment. She was not, Hattie had decided, watching her face, a bad person. She was a person who had spent her career in a system that reduced people to numbers and who had perhaps been doing it long enough that she had stopped noticing the cost. Hattie did not need her to understand. She only needed her to leave. "I'm not selling," Hattie said. "Not any of it. If you have ever been told your story was finished, this story belongs to you. $8 and the willingness to begin is sometimes all you need." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.